350,000 square kilometers of land in northern China and Xinjiang have turned into massive wounds in just 3 decades. Cracked earth stretches across the continent, while invading sands swallow dried-up rivers. One can notice how the landscape changes, signaling the collapse of a living system that functioned in stability for thousands of years. But this is just the beginning. Why could a species that vanished from nature help rescue an ecosystem on the brink of collapse? The degradation appears absolute and irreversible to the observer. Strangely, the solution comes from an animal species that was once declared extinct in the wild. To respond, China has planted 66 billion trees in an ambitious attempt to hold back the advancing deserts. The camera glides over rows of saplings struggling against the arid wind. At first glance, this massive afforestation seems sufficient, but in reality, the grassland's living roots were already gone. To save an ecosystem, sometimes trees are not enough. The process is only gaining momentum. Biological restoration turns to unexpected sources for recovery. One single species remains on Earth that has never submitted to human domestication: Przewalski's horse. Its stocky body, powerful legs, and short upright mane are not accidental features. These traits, along with sharp, constantly alert eyes, are the direct result of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in the harshest climates of Central Asia. Why is this specific animal defined by ecologists as an irreplaceable grassland regeneration machine? The answer lies in a biological adaptation that modern livestock lacks. Unlike domestic horses, this species possesses a dental structure and jaw muscles specifically designed for low-growing dry grasses. One can notice how they feed on nutrient-poor vegetation that other animals largely ignore. But this is just the beginning of their function. Herds move continuously across the steppe. At first glance, their path seems random, but in reality, it follows a complex fractal pattern described by scientists. These movements create repeating bands of grazing pressure ranging from a few meters to several kilometers in scale. It is visible how the animals graze through horizontal cutting, encouraging the grass to grow back denser and helping the soil retain carbon more effectively than livestock that pull plants out by the roots. The process is only gaining momentum as the herd passes. Their manure and urine deposit natural nitrogen and phosphorus into the earth, creating a thriving environment for soil microorganisms. This remains the most critical link in the ecosystem that humans cannot reproduce with technology. Long before trees were planted on a massive scale, it was these herds that kept the grasslands in constant motion and regeneration. And then, the wild presence abruptly disappeared. 1969 is the year marked in the registries as the final point of reliable observation for this species. By the late 19th century, and continuing through the first half of the 20th century, the horse faced a convergence of lethal threats. During periods of severe famine, hunting became a primary means of survival for many nomadic communities. Wild horses, moving across the open plains, turned into easy targets for hunters seeking sustenance. Why did the environment itself begin to reject these animals? The decline was not caused by a single event. It was a deadly feedback loop where overgrazing by livestock and the aggressive expansion of agricultural cultivation disrupted the soil balance. Settlers cleared shrubs for firewood. Meanwhile, the depletion of groundwater accelerated the drying of the earth. One can notice how the removal of grass roots allowed winds to grow stronger, sweeping across the plains with increasing velocity. Sand spread outward, burying the fertile topsoil, while water could no longer be retained in the porous ground. Grass failed to regrow in these conditions, and the land continued to degrade into a barren state. But this is just the beginning of the crisis. At first glance, the interbreeding with domestic horses seemed like a natural biological interaction, but in reality, it sharply reduced genetic purity. This dilution stripped the wild population of the specific traits necessary to survive in the wild. However, the final and most dangerous factor proved to be habitat fragmentation. In just a few decades, migration routes stretching over dozens of kilometers were ruthlessly cut by wire fences, new roads, and plowed fields. Large herds were broken into small, isolated groups, often containing only a few individuals. Lacking the genetic diversity needed to survive a harsh winter, the population crumbled. As genetic diversity declined, juvenile mortality rose sharply. Resistance to disease fell to nearly zero. According to records compiled in the IUCN Red List and the Przewalski's Horse International Stud Book, the timeline ends here. Only a few faint hoofprints and some strands of hair caught in wind-stripped grass remained for the next expedition. The researchers returned with a cold conclusion. Przewalski's horse was extinct in the wild. There are moments in natural history that make no sound. Just one morning, across a vast land, every movement ceased. Fewer than 12 individuals with reproductive potential remained when the species was finally confined to zoos. Everything becomes frighteningly silent in the wild. The ecosystem lost the force it depended on, and the loss of a single link sent the entire system over the edge. But this is just the beginning. Why did the disappearance of the horses push the entire grassland into crisis? To understand the scale of the collapse, the system must be viewed through the lens of ecology. A grassland is not just grass and soil. It is a complex network of connections between microorganisms, moisture, herbivores, and predators. When grass roots are lost, the soil physically loses the ability to retain water. One can notice how plants fail to grow in the dried earth without this moisture. When vegetation vanishes, herbivores disappear, predators move away, and the soil microbiome collapses long before humans can see the damage. At first glance, trees seem like a viable replacement for vegetation, but in reality, Przewalski's horses occupy a layer of biological dynamics that trees cannot replace. Trees remain stationary, horses move, creating grassland mosaics, distributing seeds, and recycling nutrients. And it is this movement that has been missing for decades. Therefore, because the rate of inbreeding was extremely high, every newborn had to be tracked through detailed pedigrees. A single small mistake could erase decades of effort. The Przewalski's horse stud book, established in 1959, became the most critical genetic record. It gets more complex further on. Scientists were forced to design breeding pairings using algorithmic selection to maximize genetic diversity. Many individuals were excluded from the program because their levels of inbreeding were too severe. These decisions were painful, but the process continues to the next stage. 40 degrees below zero is the temperature threshold these animals would have to endure in the wild. Why did scientists decide to release horses with weakened genetics into such a lethal environment? This period was deeply controversial within the conservation community, creating a rift between experts. Some argued that restoring a species with almost no remaining wild genes was a pointless endeavor. Others believed that nature only needed a small chance to repair itself. In 1986, China decided to attempt what no other country had dared to try. One can notice how the Yungar Basin, their ancestral homeland for thousands of years, had transformed over the centuries. It was now one of the regions undergoing the fastest desertification on Earth. The decision carried enormous risk, as the harsh environment offered no mercy to the unadapted. But this is just the beginning of the challenge, because keeping the species alive in captivity only postponed the inevitable question of survival. 18 individuals from Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States were brought to Xinjiang. They lived in vast semi-wild enclosures, learning to find water, withstand sand-laden winds, and survive the brutal cold. At first glance, the task seems simple, but in reality, releasing them without this training would mean death in the very first winter. If the experiment failed, the collective efforts of the entire world would vanish instantly. Scientists did not know whether the horses could adapt or if they still remembered how to live in the wild. It gets more complex further on. Specific individuals were carefully selected for physical strength and sufficient genetic diversity to ensure the herd's future. One can observe the unique codes assigned to them, such as 6H0113 and 5F122. These animals became known as the Yungar Herd 1, ready to attempt the first reintroduction experiment.